Senator Higgins has some questions.
Yes.
Senator.
Thank you very, very much for both your very powerful testimony and indeed for the ongoing work that you've been doing. I think the information is stark, and what's also stark is that we were warned and these things were signalled and have been signalled for a long time. I think, as Deputy O'Snuddy said, they were signalled when Ireland decided to change its approach. And I think, when we talk about do ships with these goals make a difference or not, we actually have the evidence previously of that. Because during the period of time in which Ireland was operating on its own, in the Pontus deal in relation with Italy, and focusing on humanitarian search and rescue, during the same period of time where just one Irish ship was operating over a number of years, Ireland, and I think people were so proud of it, rescued 17,500 lives from the Mediterranean. During the same period of time, the previous incarnation of Operation Sophia, which had on average 5 to 6 ships, and you may correct me if I'm wrong, but on average 5 to 6, sometimes more and sometimes slightly less, rescued 34,000, 5 times the number of ships, and only twice as many people rescued, because its priority was not humanitarian search and rescue. They're in the same waters and seeing the same things. And Paul Keogh was very clear when Ireland joined Operation Sophia, in terms of if we're concerned about a shift, it was stated, he said, transferring to this is exactly 1 year ago, July last year, transferring to Operation Sophia will result in the redeployment of Irish Naval Service vessels from primarily humanitarian search and rescue operations to primarily security and interception operations. That is a quote from the Minister for Defence. It's very clear. And that's the decision that was made. And that left a space where NGOs have moved. So we've moved from a situation where our papers in Ireland are celebrating and showing the search and rescue and what has been done by our Navy, and I share the pride in our Navy that everyone has expressed, to that being in the papers, to a situation whereby we've flipped to concerns and worries and kind of insinuations about the operations that maybe NGOs are taking place in. And so I think we need to be very clear. I think this is bad for Europe, because when we start militarising our borders in this way, we see the ripple effects in the militarisation of borders within Europe, because that is the next step. And it's bad in terms of our humanitarian reputation. Because I think something that's really concerning is this idea of the pull factor. And that we need to kind of almost, because it's very, very similar to what we've seen in the Mexican-American border. They're not pulling particular families apart and taking children away and interning them because they're concerned about those families. They want to send an example and a signal. And the idea that we could let people drown as an example or a signal to others is the same kind of message. And it's not the way to tackle the traffickers. I think we've heard about the root causes, and the root causes are not boats. But what I'd like to just talk to you about, we talked about the traffic. These are my questions, and I'll be very brief on them. In terms of the questions of tackling trafficking, I mean, would you agree that the financial model and the financial incentives is where that can be tackled? By providing safe passage and alternative routes that mean, for example, and we have a family reunification bill before the Houses at the moment from my own group, and other safe passage routes, so that there are legal routes, and that's for those whose loved one is living here in Europe. And that's one reason people will take a desperate journey. Have routes, for example, to reach them, have legal routes. Are any of those routes operating out of Libya? Are people who are interred in Libya being given access to making claims, to seeking reunification, to any of those measures of safe passage is a key question. And the other question is there, in terms of financial incentivisation, do you have concerns around EU money financially incentivising the warehousing of people? Is there a concern that it may be per head, that there may be a drive to bring people into Libya and then to, say, store them so that they can be in these detention centres and being paid for head? We know in private prisons in the US, we know from even direct provision here, that any situation where you incentivise the warehousing of people, you create a perverse incentive. Perhaps, I don't know if you might touch on Sudan and similar migration control agreements that Europe has signed with Sudan as well. The question of aid, and do you have concerns around tied aid? It's a very strong tradition Ireland has had of untied aid, but increasingly there seems to be that blurring line between the EU defence spending and when we told that we're investing, and I think it was put very eloquently by Deputy O'Snuddy in terms of what are we putting in as actual support versus support to governments? And again, Sudan comes in that concern. I also had just a really very quick question around the financial, around the UN concerns that are there, and are there, what other pressures can Ireland play as a country which is bidding for the Security Council at the moment, to show that we're very serious about this UN laws and how we can take it seriously. We in fact mentioned our mass migration in our bid just last week, which is somewhat ironic given that we haven't hit our 4,000 target, and that we sent 200,000 people abroad ourselves in the last decade. So I know that these are probably more statements, but I would really, on the financial model, on the perverse incentives, on the real shift in policy in terms of what it means on the ground in terms of search and rescue and things, and your concerns around the militarisation of the borders. If you could just touch on those, and maybe Sudan. Thank you.
Thanks, Senator Higgins.
Okay. Thank you so much for, in general, the question that's so to the point and really hitting where it hurts. Regarding the money, I'm going to be very honest. MSF has tried for a long period of time to understand exactly the financial movement, and it's very unclear. There's a lack of transparency that is staggering. A lot of countries put money into the Africa Trust Fund of the European Union, including Ireland. Some of that money is then assigned to Italy, and then Italy uses it, and this is the part where we lose track. So it's very easy to say the EU as such, the Commission, for example, is not financing detention centers. However, there's also this organized system or lack of transparency in order to support that. For example, Minister of Interior Salvini has just announced that 10 or 12 more assets will be provided to the Libyan Coast Guard. Where is the money coming from? We ask these questions, we don't get answers. Maybe as members of parliament, you'll get these answers. And as a European citizen, I also want to make sure that my taxes are not fueling human rights violations. The discourse of some politicians is very much to focus on the pull factor, never to mention the push factors, and never to mention the complexity, including the lack of safe and legal routes. 90% of Eritreans who make it to Europe will get asylum in Europe. Yet, no resettlement, not a single place of an Eritrean from Kenya or Ethiopia or Sudan has taken place. Family reunification is extremely difficult. Because of the seriousness of the violations in Libya and because of the CNN video, it created some sort of sense of urgency. And then the UNHCR was able to secure a deal with Niger to evacuate to Niger the most vulnerable people. That was with the promise that these people will be resettled in Europe. How many have been resettled? The center opened in November. About 200 people have been resettled, to a point that Niger had to suspend the program because they were seeing people arriving, the most vulnerable ones, the unaccompanied minors, the women and the children from Eritrea and Somalia, and they would not be resettled. So when we talk about comprehensive, actually we're only looking at passing the buck to somebody else and at ensuring that it becomes somebody else's problem while promising that we would help, and we never help. We have the example of the EU-Turkey deal and how many people have been resettled from Turkey, how many people are stuck in Greece currently. So my impression working on these issues is that there's a discourse that's extremely perverse that is about also, it's all about bypassing the law. For example, Italy has been condemned by the European Court of Human Rights for breaching the prohibition of torture and the principle of non-refoulement, for their cooperation with the Libyan Coast Guard. So what do we do now? We train the Libyan Coast Guard, we equip the Libyan Coast Guard, we help them set up a search and rescue region, we get them to do the dirty business for us. and to say it's not us. However, our marks are all over. And we can't simply say we're doing this in the name of saving lives, because that's what we hear. We're supporting the Libyan Coast Guard because they are saving lives. Of course, nobody wants anyone to drown at sea. But saving life means disembarking them in a place of safety. Does not mean taking them to detention centers where they might end up in the very same cycle of abuse. Talking about Sudan, MSF, I work for MSF Amsterdam. We don't have operations in Sudan, but other operational centers have operations in Sudan. We are in a situation, and I've talked from a non-specialist point of view, where the EU is supporting the Rapid Intervention Force, formerly known as the Janjaweed. And I think that says it all.